My name is Maya, 29, and the first thing my parents said when they walked into my apartment wasn't, "Congratulations." It was, "You owe us." I just closed the round of meetings that got me promoted to lead product manager, a job title that came with a pay bump big enough that my accountant texted a celebratory emoji. I had been living on ramen and secondhand furniture for years, clawing my way out of the kind of paycheck-to-paycheck life that teaches you the exact weight of every cent. For the first time in a long time, I felt the horizon tilt in my favor. A cushion for my student loans, a down payment glimmering in a spreadsheet, an emergency fund that didn't require me to do mental gymnastics before buying groceries. They came in wearing their Sunday best entitlement. Evelyn, my mother, smiled the kind of smile that tried to be warm while measuring your worth. Martin, my father, had that slow, practiced look of a man who has learned the art of saying uncomfortable things in the voice of reasonable concern. They didn't bring flowers or a cake. They brought a demand. 50%, my father announced, like he was naming the weather. Half of your monthly income. You owe us for raising you. The air in my living room went thin. I could hear the refrigerator humming, like the only rational thing left. Evelyn perched on my couch, the way she used to perch in my childhood home, legs crossed, back straight, as if returning to a stage. She explained, in carefully measured sentences, that parenting is an investment, and now the investment must be repaid. They talked about sacrifices I already knew about. They turned my childhood into a ledger, and my adult paycheck into collateral. I pointed out rent, student loans, the plumbing I'd been ignoring because I didn't have cushion money. I mentioned the promotion, how thrilled I was, how I wanted to celebrate with friends, maybe finally replace the oven that only half cooks. They nodded like they heard me, then folded their concern into entitlement and repeated the demand, 50%. It wasn't just the number. It was how they presented it. As if a single line in my monthly statement could erase the years I'd spent building myself authentically away from their control. They framed it like a family tradition, like a moral law. They used the word owe with an economy of emotion that implied I had already agreed. They were simply reminding me of the terms. I stood there in the small, sun-slit rectangle of my living room and felt something inside the apartment shift. This wasn't a request. It wasn't even manipulation dressed up nicely. It was a takeover disguised as gratitude. The new salary wasn't a celebration for me. It was a target. What was supposed to be the start of breathing room had been intercepted by people who saw my progress as their entitlement. They didn't stay long. They left instructions on how to transfer their share, as if setting up automatic payments made the audacity more palatable. Behind them, the door clicked shut, and the apartment felt simultaneously smaller and somehow more mine. Because for the first time since I'd left home at 18, there was a price being attached to the boundaries I'd been trying so hard to set. I left when I was 18 with a duffel, 3 shirts, and a refusal to ever let anyone put a price tag on my life. My name is Maya, 29, which is math I do in exhale now, because every year between then and now feels like a small construction project I paid for with patience and boxed lunches. The first few months were a ledger of micro-survivals. Morning shifts at a coffee shop where I learned to steam milk so my hands wouldn't shake, nights folding inventory at a boutique for a laughable wage, weekends answering customer support emails until my eyes felt like they belonged to someone else. I slept on a friend's futon, then in a studio that was basically a shoebox with a window. When people talk about paying dues, they often mean something abstract. For me, it meant learning to budget in decimals so precise a dropped latte felt like a felony. It meant learning Excel by tutorial videos at 2 a.m. and practicing answers to interview questions until they sounded like me instead of a script. I didn't ask for charity. I asked for opportunity. I took internships, answered cold emails, sent resumes that read like invitations to a better version of myself. I ate thrift store meals and bought textbooks with coupons. I learned that career momentum was mostly about showing up when everyone else was exhausted and then showing up again the next day. Brick by brick, an after-hours certification, and a handful of people who mentored me because they saw I showed up. I learned to love the arithmetic of progress, A month of no takeout equals 1 new pair of shoes that didn't have holes. 2 months of late nights equals a savings goal finally ticked green. So when I finally started breathing a little easier, when a promotion actually arrived and the spreadsheet looked like forgiveness instead of scarcity, it felt fragile and sacred. That's why my parents' reaction landed like a fissure. For them, my independence wasn't the culmination of late-night hustle and thrift store thriftiness. It was a balance sheet they felt authorized to audit. They kept what I call emotional tabs. It started as yardstick compliments and turned into leverage. Reminders of the tuition they paid, selectively remembered. Anecdotes about the nights they stayed up while I was sick, conveniently unmentioned when I missed their calls. And a ledger of favors I was apparently still in debt for. Affection came on a conditional basis, like an ornate coin that had to be returned after use. A good grade warranted praise, but a late rent payment warranted an epic recounting of the sacrifices they made. Their memory of history was a ledger that never balanced in my favor. This behavior didn't look like shouting. It was skillfully quiet. A compliment on a new coat followed by a sigh about kids these days who don't appreciate family values. A check-in text that read like concern but ended in an expectation. If I told my parents about a small victory, it would be turned into a footnote. It's wonderful, dear, but remember what we did for you. The message was subtle, relentless. Gratitude without reciprocity, guilt without compassion. I made a promise to myself back then, not because I wanted to spite anyone, but because I had learned how easily people can try to own the parts of you that look like prosperity. I would build a life where I could say no without needing permission. I would not let gratitude be a tether that stayed attached to my ankle as I tried to run towards something better. So when they came demanding half my income, it felt like all those careful bricks were being treated like a communal wall someone else had claimed to. It wasn't just money. It was every small moment of self-sovereignty I'd paid for with insomnia and thrifted meals. The resentment simmered because what they called repayment looked an awful lot like erasure. Erasing the nights I paid my own bills, the rejection emails I swallowed and turned into resumes, the friends who lent me furniture when I couldn't afford a couch. I had learned to be proud of the work it took to get here. I also learned to protect it. The irony was that their memories, precise when it served them, fuzzy when it didn't, were the exact weapon they thought entitled them to my present. That kind of entitlement is harder to argue with than math. It's built on stories and selective recollection. I'd been rehearsing my answer for weeks in my head, but the truth is, half of what I wanted to say couldn't be fitted into a single conversation. It's messy to explain that your independence is both the product of hard work and the defense against people who would count your successes as theirs. I closed the door on their backs and then opened it again. Not because I wanted to let them back in, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain they heard me. The apartment smelled like lemon cleaner and the faint residue of celebration. Somewhere in the kitchen, a mug steamed where I'd left my coffee. I put my hands on my hips like it was a meeting and not a family ambush. "Listen," I said, and I kept my voice calm on purpose. Anger is a currency they recognize. Calm is the one they don't. "No, I won't be paying you 50% of anything." They blinked as if I'd offered them a foreign coin. Evelyn's smile thinned into something sharper, an attempt at wounded dignity. Martin's face went into that slow, rehearsed frown he uses when he wants to sound reasonable. "You don't understand," Martin started, the howls of entitlement strapped into syllables. "We helped you." "You raised me," I interrupted. "Yes, you raised me. You don't get to invoice my adulthood." The words felt tidy in my mouth, the kind you rehearse in the shower and then finally use where it matters. I named specifics because specifics are harder to argue with than feelings. I listed the scholarships I fought for, the nights I worked double shifts, the time my landlord raised the rent and I negotiated until I could afford to stay. I laid out in short sentences the tracks of my life, how each rail was laid by my hands and the small, stubborn people who taught me how to stand. I watched their faces try to fold those truths into the cardboard box of their narrative. It didn't fit. Evelyn reached for the old tactic, the soft, personal anecdote meant to sidestep logic. "We sacrificed," she said, the way people use the word when they want a loan of your empathy. "Sacrifice doesn't equal ownership," I said. "It doesn't give you the right to demand my paycheck." For a moment, they tried shaming me. Subtle, old-school guilt. "You're being selfish? You're turning your back." It came with the familiar timbre of long-practiced lines, the same ones they've used in family scenes for decades. I let it wash over me like a wave, and then I stepped out of the surf. I reached to the side table and picked up a manila envelope I'd placed there that morning, mid-breath, after the promotion email hit my phone and before they messaged to ask if I'd be celebrating. It wasn't showy, no ribbon, no dramatic flourish, just an ordinary envelope, the kind of thing you use to deliver something that needs looking at. "Take this," I said. "I brought it for you." My voice was deliberate. I wanted the moment to register slowly, a watching stone dropped into a quiet pond. Evelyn's hand hovered over the envelope as if it might explode. Martin's jaw tightened the way it does when he's trying to decide whether to scowl or to charm. They expected theatrics, maybe receipts, maybe ultimatums. They weren't expecting me to be prepared. I didn't open the envelope. I didn't need to. The act of offering it did a job that words hadn't. It shifted the power, the way a mirror shows someone the face they've been avoiding. They took it because they couldn't not. Their fingers brushed mine for half a second. Familiar, intrusive. And then they had the envelope, and I had my refusal said out loud, neat as a signed form. I closed the distance and sat down on the couch. The apartment felt like a courtroom. Only the judge had a face I recognized in the mirror. The silence that filled the room was not peaceful. It was waiting. I slid the envelope across the coffee table and watched their hands close around it like scavengers finding a prize. For a beat, they seemed to think they'd finally hold the proof of their victory, my compliance in black and white. Instead, they found the thing that made their petition look like a child's paper fort, an actual legal anchor. On top was a notarized affidavit dated 3 years earlier. It had my name, Maya Lopez, 26 at the time, typed exactly, followed by a single clear sentence signed by both Evelyn and Martin. "We acknowledge that our daughter is an independent adult and that we will not hold her legally or financially liable for our personal financial decisions." The document had the county clerk's stamp, the notary's embossed seal, and the signatures looping like final acts. Below their signatures was my own. I remembered that day. An argument had blown up, emotions were raw, and I dragged them, stubborn and furious, to a notary to get a paper that would force them to put their promises into something that couldn't be reshaped by guilt. They'd been reluctant then, angry theatrical, but they had signed. I kept a copy, because the world teaches you to archive your own sanity. Beneath the affidavit, I'd placed another thing, a printed copy of the petition filed in family court the previous week, and next to it, the internal message logs I'd exported from my phone months earlier. The petition was brazen, screenshots of text exchanges presented as if I'd agreed to send monthly transfers, language claiming informal verbal agreements, and a list of evidence that read like a bad forgery. The screenshots in the filing were grainy, obviously edited, different fonts, mismatched pixelation, timestamps that jumped like a broken metronome. I loved the quiet that followed. Quiet is where details breathe. Evelyn flipped through the pages, her fingers trembling the way someone's do when they realize a script has been rewritten without their consent. Martin's face moved through 5 different negotiations in 30 seconds. Bluster, shame, anger, and finally the pale calculation of someone who's been called out. "You signed this?" I asked, and it wasn't an accusation so much as a reminder of a contract that had teeth. They both opened their mouths. The sound they made was the sound of people realizing the map they'd been following led them into a dead end. Evelyn tried the old pivot, we thought, but found herself distracted by the notary's seal. Martin stammered, "That's not," and then stopped because the county stamp made it impossible to finish that sentence. I pointed to the petition. "And this," I said, "is your attempt to use doctored screenshots as leverage." I tapped the phone logs beside it. These are my actual message exports, timestamps, delivery receipts, and the backups your screenshots don't match. The texts in your petition were fabricated after the times they claim to exist. Look at the metadata. Look at the edits. Evelyn's throat worked. We were worried, she began, but the affidavit sat between us like an immovable fact. They had willingly put their names to a statement that made any claim on my wages legally ridiculous. Then they had turned around and filed a case built on Photoshop and selective memory. It was audacity with a legal stamp. The house felt small the way a stage does when the audience finally sees the strings. The indignation that had powered their demand evaporated into something thinner, embarrassment, then a defensive rage that had nothing to hide behind. They tried to argue technicalities, clerical errors, misunderstandings. We didn't mean that clause. As if words notarized and signed could be shrugged off like a hat. I let them finish and then read the affidavit aloud, slow and deliberate, each syllable a small legal incision. When I said the notary's name in the county, I watched Martin's jaw drop like a closing trap. Evelyn's eyes were glassy. There was no script left to perform. Then I slid the final sheet across the table. A note I'd written to myself the night I saved the first copy. Timestamps, the notary's contact, where I'd filed the original with my lawyer. The notary's number was there. The export file names for my phone logs were there too. It was meticulous and boring, and that was the point. The minutia made it undeniable. They made a last, limp attempt to reclaim the narrative. Claims about family, obligation, debt, but we sacrificed. And the affidavit made that line wobble. Sacrifice can be emotional truth. A notarized contract is a legal one. They had chosen to sign one. They had chosen to publish the other. When they left that day, the envelope was half emptied of their bravado. They took their copies, clutching them like talismans that no longer fit. I sat back and felt the odd, cool clarity that comes when a lie is exposed. The world reshuffles, and the things you paid for with your own time and grit finally look less fragile. The knock on my door that afternoon was different. Official, not familial. Dana, my lawyer, arrived like someone who had slept 3 hours and then read every relevant statute twice for fun. She wore the exact expression of a person who believes in paperwork as a weapon. Behind her was an officer in a plain uniform whose badge flashed like a punctuation mark. My parents' eyes went from smug to startled in the span of a single heartbeat. Entitlement doesn't travel well when it meets protocol. Dana didn't bother with pleasantries. She placed a neat stack of papers on my coffee table and folded her hands. "These are copies," she said, voice even. "You've been served." The officer handed them over. A civil motion to dismiss their petition, accompanied by a criminal complaint for filing falsified evidence and attempted coercion. There was also a subpoena for bank records and a request for preservation of electronic data. The language was clinical, the kind of thing that turns bluster into boxes to check. My parents tried to laugh it off. Martin attempted a performance of irritation. Evelyn's mouth tried to invent an explanation and found no ground. The officer explained, clearly and politely, that while being served did not mean they were under arrest, the complaint alleged enough concern for investigators to open a file. He asked if they would come down to the station to give a statement. For once, the choreography of righteous indignation broke. Martin hemmed, Evelyn swallowed, and they chose silence. Dana leaned toward me and mouthed, "Good." Little moves like that felt like solidarity worn in jeans. Court the next week felt like the inside of a magnifying glass. The room was the kind of place where uniforms, robes, and legal pads create an air of finality. My parents sat stiff. They looked like two actors who'd forgotten their lines. Dana spoke in a voice that made the judge pay attention. She laid out the affidavit, the metadata inconsistencies, and the newly filed criminal complaint alleging fabrication of evidence. The judge, a woman whose patience I found instantly respectful, reviewed the exhibits with the slow precision of someone who has seen every human smallness and knows how to calendar it. The turning point came when my grandmother, Clara Rivera, rose to testify. I had tried to prepare myself for what she might say. Grandmothers have mercy in their bones, but Clara had something else, an unvarnished memory, and the kind of bluntness that embarrasses liars. She described the years in which my parents took loans for the house and never paid them back, how they'd sold jewelry that had been family heirlooms, and the time they'd cashed a check meant for my college tuition and told her it had been lost. Her voice didn't tremble. It was steady, with the kind of clarity that comes from watching a pattern over decades. She confirmed under oath that she had never received financial support from them for my upbringing, and that, in fact, she had provided what little she could. The courtroom was quiet in a way that made the truth sound louder than any argument. When the judge issued the ruling, there was no theatrics, just a clean, decisive voice that felt like a final paragraph. The petition was dismissed. The judge found probable cause to refer the falsified exhibits to the district attorney for further review and imposed monetary sanctions for filing fabricated evidence. The fines were not ruinous, but they were precisely measured to sting, a legal chastisement with teeth. In the back of the courtroom, the press, tiny, polite local reporters, had been tipped off. The story of a parental support petition built on doctored screenshots, made for the kind of small-town scandal that people whisper about in line at the post office. Walking out of the courthouse, the sunlight felt absurdly ordinary. I didn't do a speech. Dana gave me a look that said, "You handled that well." And Clara squeezed my hand like she was closing a long, stubborn book. My parents avoided our eyes. Their collapse into silence was perhaps the clearest, quietest revenge of all. The law had not only protected me, it had forced them to stop using my life as a ledger. Justice, in the civil sense, landed not as fireworks, but as a recalibration. The official record now reflected what I already knew. After the judge spoke, something in me unclenched. Not all the way, not suddenly, but like a hand easing its grip on a hot pan. The noise of the courthouse receded and left me with a quiet I hadn't realized I'd been starving for. That week, I started packing with a kind of deliberate slowness, the way someone moves fragile things after a storm. Boxes became talismans. The lamp I'd thrifted my first month out, the stack of notebooks filled with interview prep and grocery lists, a chipped mug with a lipstick ring that smelled like late nights and resumes. Moving day felt ceremonial. Friends showed up with pizza and an army of boxes, and the practical kind of tenderness that carries tea kettles up narrow stairs. Dana sent a text that was a gif of a tiny triumphant cat and a single word, "Finally." Clara pressed a small card into my hands the morning I taped the final box shut. Her handwriting was a little unsteady, the ink smudged where she'd pressed too hard, and inside she had written a few sentences that were more permission than anything else. Proud, relieved, a joke about me finally upgrading from a mattress that had more personality than support. The card was ridiculous and consequential at once, proof that someone had seen the whole thing and chosen my side. I unpacked slowly, laying things out in the new place as if I were laying claim. A lamp in the corner that made a softer light, a plant that the internet assured me would survive with minimal effort, a mug that no longer had lipstick rings but did have the faint scent of cleaning lemon and new carpet. The first night I fell asleep without rehearsing retorts. I woke up without an anxiety kicked like a pebble under my ribs. That ordinary peace was the real reward, not the dismissal papers or the fines, but the ability to eat breakfast without cataloging possible arguments for my life. A week later, an envelope arrived, stamped in my parents' handwriting despite everything. For a second, the old reflex hummed, read, respond, placate. I stood in my kitchen and felt every old pattern like old muscles twitching. The letter was polite in a way that made the politeness feel sharp, pleas for a meeting, a gentle reminder of family obligations, and a paragraph that tried to reframe the petition as a misunderstanding. They signed it with the same names who had once signed the affidavit and the same hands that had filed the falsified petition. The paper smelled faintly of their cologne and something like rehearsal. I didn't open the letter in full. I don't know why, maybe because reading it would be an invitation to engage, or because engagement is what they wanted. Instead, I walked to the little recycling bin by the sink, looked at the envelope like it was a live wire, and dropped it in without drama. The sound it made was domestic and final. There was no dramatic tearing or public burning. There was a private, exacting release, proof that not every battle needs fireworks to end. Later, Clara called. Her voice was quieter than usual, older in a way that made me sit up straighter. She said she'd sent flowers, a casserole recipe, a joke about my lack of indoor plants. She told me to paint the spare room bright if I wanted. "You earned a life that's yours," she said, and then she laughed at herself for sounding like a parent. Her words were both a benediction and a shield. When I turned off the light that night, the apartment felt fuller, in the best way, with lived-in evidence that I had chosen myself. There was still sadness tangled in the day. Small griefs for the relationship I'd hoped would look different, but it was tempered by relief. The law had written a line on paper. I'd written a line in my life. They didn't match, and that was okay. The world I'd been building felt less precarious, and for the first time in many years, the future looked like a space I was allowed to occupy without asking permission. Clara's funeral was the kind of gentle pall that made the city feel like it had paused just long enough to listen. People I hadn't seen in years showed up with casseroles and stories. Neighbors who remembered her humming while she swept the stoop. A Sunday school teacher who swore Clara was the only person who could make a lemon pie that tasted like forgiveness. I read a short piece I'd written about her once lending me a coat when I left at 18. How she'd said, without drama, "Take it. You'll need it more than I will." The room laughed and then cried in the same breath, because that was Clara. Small practicalities wrapped in an enormous, quiet heart. A week after the funeral, the lawyer called with the kind of administrative kindness that still felt like an inheritance. Clara had left me her house, small, a little lopsided, full of the kind of wallpaper patterns that belong to another era. The first time I stepped inside alone after the estate meeting, sunlight fell across the linoleum in a way that made dust motes look like an orchestra. The kitchen still smelled faintly of lemon and old soap. And in the drawer where she kept coupons, I found a single sticky note that read, "For Maya, feed the cat, don't forget to call, have fun." I laughed, then cried, then measured the rooms like someone taking inventory of what love felt like in square feet. Selling the house felt oddly ceremonial. I staged it with a minimal touch, soft linens, a vase of wildflowers that Clara would have rolled her eyes at, and watched buyers walk through, praise the vintage charm, and whisper about potential. The sale closed with signatures and a check that felt like something both huge and perfectly ordinary. I could have kept the house, turned it into a visitable museum of Clara's recipes and counsel, but I wanted the chapter to be a gift, not a shrine. I took the proceeds and did something Clara would have approved of. I sold the house and donated a substantial portion to a local organization that supports women recovering from financial abuse. They help with counseling, financial literacy, and emergency housing, things that carve out pathways where predators of power and entitlement can't follow. I included a short note with the donation, for Clara Rivera, because she taught me to carry my own coat. The charity sent a thank you that felt like a postcard from something hopeful. They mentioned a pilot program the funds would support, and the image of women learning to balance a budget without fear lodged somewhere in my chest, like a small, steady ember. Legal closure hadn't fixed everything. Grief doesn't tie with a neat bow, and some evenings I still miss the possibility of what my relationship with my parents could have been. There is a hollow where old conversations should live, and occasionally the temptation to answer a demand letter with a paragraph that tastes like revenge. Mostly I choose different rituals. Tending the small plant Clara gifted me, writing letters no one will read, spending money on a couch that doesn't creak when I sit down. The real change is subtler. Boundaries have become ordinary tools, not dramatic acts. I say no without rehearsing. Hang up when calls feel like tests, and let other people's versions of history stay where they belong, on their side of the fence. Freedom, I've learned, is less about a single triumphant gesture, and more about the tiny, cumulative decisions that make a life livable. Keeping the money I earned, letting myself rest, accepting kindness without suspicion. Sometimes, when I unlock my front door, sunlight will hit the floor in the same angle Clara's did. And for a second, the city feels a little smaller, kinder. I think of her in the quiet, in the way I now teach myself to be both firm and tender. I tell the story of the affidavit and the petition like a punchline, and then remember to tell the other part. How a woman who baked lemon pies left me the courage and the roof to build a life where I can say no and mean it.